some of my experiences with that and other experiences early on, I think, led me to focus more on the question of, where are the gaps in biosecurity, right? Where are the things that we really need to focus our attention? I didn't feel like those early efforts were PADRAP and other things people we're doing then and still doing today, were very good at helping us answer that question. And so kind of over time evolved to explore some of the concepts with a program called HACCP that's used in the food industry. So that stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point.
Welcome to the Swine Canada podcast show, brought to you by Biosecurity. We are dedicated to bringing you the latest insights and discussions in the Canadian pork industry. So I'm Miranda Smith, and I'll be the host for today's episode. And today's guest is Dr. Derald Holtkamp, who is a professor at Iowa State University. So welcome to the show, Derald.
Thanks, Miranda. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about biosecurity, which seems to be an often recurring theme in our podcast show. But before we start with that, can you first give us a little bit of a background on, how, what you're doing right now and how you got there?
Yeah, I'm a professor at Iowa State University here in the College of Vet Med, and I joined the faculty in 2006, so going on almost 20 years next year here. And I have a mixed appointment, teaching and some research and outreach. And most of what I've tried to focus on then for all of those is biosecurity, and goes back really even prior to that time. I was working on some surveys, one that some of our listeners may remember called PADRAP. It was a survey to do biosecurity assessments. And so it was lessons learned from those early attempts to try to help producers and veterinarians with biosecurity, and kind of frustrations that came along with using those and not being able to answer some of the questions I thought we should be able to answer, that kind of led me to where we are today, or where I and my students are. And so I'm really glad to join you today to talk about that.
Okay, so yeah, we can jump right in. So what is it that you're doing nowadays?
Yeah, so really this probably goes back even further than the last few years. I would say in the early 2000s is where I really kind of latched on to this idea of biosecurity. And I at that time thought, given the way that we raise pigs today, which is really very different than we did 30 or 40 years ago, I just felt like it was critical that we get a better handle on biosecurity. And so that's really what I've focused on the last, let's say, going on 20 years here now. And some of our older listeners may remember a program called PADRAP that we developed years ago. It was a survey intended to be a biosecurity assessment. And some of my experiences with that and other experiences early on, I think, led me to focus more on the question of, where are the gaps in biosecurity, right? Where are the things that we really need to focus our attention? I didn't feel like those early efforts were PADRAP and other things people we're doing then and still doing today, were very good at helping us answer that question. And so kind of over time evolved to explore some of the concepts with a program called HACCP that's used in the food industry. So that stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. And it was really developed when they were sending astronauts into space in the 1960s. They wanted to make sure they didn't give them food poisoning. And so it was designed to prevent that. And so I wouldn't tell you that we've adapted that wholesale. And so if you Google HACCP, you'll find lots of stuff out there, all the steps that are involved. It's very complicated sometimes. We've tried to not get that deep into the weeds on it, but try to use some of the more helpful concepts from it. And so one of the ideas here is identifying biosecurity hazards, right? And so to doing a hazard analysis, which is essentially a study of the production process to identify where those biosecurity hazards might lie. And so that's really what we focused on here. And so the whole idea is to identify those biosecurity hazards that are putting the farm at most risk, right? So you can prioritize those and then develop or come up with control measures to deal with them. And then the other sort of corollary to that, and again, as part of HACCP, is this idea of a critical control point. And what that really is a step in the production process where you say, we've got to get that one right. Right. Or we've got to make sure that happens nearly correctly, nearly every time. You probably can't hope for 100%. But this idea of making that happen, today, the approach sometimes is, it feels like, we'll train them how to do these things and then hope that they do them, assuming they know how to do them now. And that's clearly not good enough, right? We know that's inadequate, that we have to monitor things and do a better job of controlling those things. And so that's kind of the next step in the evolution of this, I guess. Where we're headed with this is how do we do that? Some cameras and things like that. People are starting to use a lot of the things that we put in place, or SOPs we put in place. About the only way to monitor those is put a camera in there and watch how people do them, right? And so a lot more work in that area. But, truck washes, having ways to monitor, disinfectant use or amount of disinfectant use and things like that. I think technology is going to help us with some of those things down the road, but it's not quite there yet today.
So, you mentioned critical control points. So can you talk a little bit about, like, in your research, of what you've seen, what critical control points are important and that we need to focus on as an industry?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. And it is an example because one of the reasons why you have to invest the time is that it is different from one production system to another, and even one farm to another. But one of the recurring themes that we see as we go out and do outbreak investigations is in the livestock transport area. And the way we think about this, about what a biosecurity hazard is we think in terms of failures. And there's 3 failures that have to happen for a pathogen like a PRRS virus or PD virus, for example, to get transmitted to a herd. And the first pathogen is that something that could carry that pathogen, either by being infected or contaminated with it, has to get contaminated or infected. So that's the first failure. Second failure is a failure to mitigate that contamination or infection. And then the third failure happens after the truck and trailer and the driver, in the case of livestock transport, show up at the farm, right? And so that if that virus is still on the trailer or the driver or the truck, it has to somehow get from them to the pigs in the herd, right? And so that's all 3 of those failures have to happen for a virus to be transmitted. And so we define a biosecurity hazard as anything that can increase the probability of any of those 3 failures, right? So what we often see with livestock transport, though, is if they have a fleet of trailers, they have lots of contact points, right? Lots of other swine farms. They may be also contacting cull markets or slaughter plants or things like that. And so that likelihood of that first failure, that they're going to get contaminated, is very high. It's almost certain that happens on a regular basis. And so then as we skip ahead to the third failure, the things that happen once that truck and trailer arrive to load wean pigs or load cull sows, if you look at how that's being done, it's very likely that if there's anything on that trailer or even on the driver, it's going to get kicked back onto the chute and then drugged back into the barns, and then has a good possibility of getting the pigs. So it puts all the pressure on that second failure, that mitigation step, right? And so if they're washing trailers between every load, when you start spending some time at these truck washes, you realize, oh my gosh, there's just very little control and monitoring of what goes on there, right? So they may be disinfecting, they are cleaning, and even using detergent. They may be disinfecting with chemical disinfectants, and then maybe even baking them. But they're not monitoring the temperature of the baking. They're not monitoring the concentration of the disinfectant and how much is applied, how long it's applied, what the contact time is. They're just not monitoring any of that. And so you're just left with hoping that those things get done correctly. And arguably in this case, you hopefully by now would recognize, those are critical control points, right? We do need to make sure that those get done right every time. And so leaving them to chance, so to speak, as we do today, is just not acceptable. So that's probably my most frequently recurring area where we say, okay, there's a critical control point there. Now, what do we need to do about that? So,
And then is it also your job then to say, like, what are we doing about this? Or is that more other people's?
Yeah. That's, of course, when we do these, that's everybody wants to go there right away. Right. And of course, that's where we need to go. I'll be transparent, though. I usually try to resist going there too quickly. And the reason I do that and making, sort of recommendations, say, well, you should do this. And the reason I'm hesitant to do that right away is that you really have to have a very good understanding of not only the production processes, but how the culture of the company and who does what, right? And so some things I could recommend something that just is in one company is completely unworkable, right? And in another company, they may have figured it out and got it to work. So, but the thing I can bring to the table, because I've done so many of these outbreak investigations, is I have seen lots of really good ideas out there how people do things and how they get some of these things done, right? But that still doesn't mean everybody can do it that way, right? And it really is system dependent. And so I like to be involved in conversations afterwards to say, okay, well, how can you best deal with this, or what are the kinds of control measures you can put in place? What options do you have for monitoring this? Recording data, being able to go out and audit that, make sure it's being done correctly. And so I like to be involved in those discussions, but I resist the urge to say, well, you just need to do this.
That makes sense. So you mentioned you've done a lot of outbreak investigations. Can you tell us a little bit about your approach in doing those?
So that it's really again borrows heavily from HACCP, and we do it as what in HACCP language that we call a hazard analysis, and it's really a process analysis where you study the production processes, and you're not. We do those. We sort of organize our investigations around what we call an entry event. So anytime something comes onto the farm, so like if semen enters, or an employee enters, or feed is delivered to the farm, all of those things, even when wean pigs or cull sows are removed, that's still an entry event because the truck, trailer, and driver have to come there and get them. And so we organize our investigations around that. And so we study the production processes, not just what happens at the farm, but everything. We try to understand the whole production process, and mind you that some of those details we have to learn over time. You don't always get all the details right out of the gate, but we do these on the farm, and again we start with semen entry and we work through that, and then we go to gilt entry and work through that. We have a specific order that we follow every time. We think it's a comprehensive list of entry events that we have for at least for sow farms, and we do these for weaned growing pig sites as well. But we work our way through there, and then I sometimes describe this in the past as we want to know the details of all the production processing, right? The who, what, when, where, and how. We've refined that a little bit now to kind of talk more in terms of the three aspects of the production process, and those being the operational procedures. So that's kind of the how they do things, who does them, when did they do them, types of questions. And then the second is what we call the structural aspects. That's kind of the where. And the structural aspects would be things like how is the site laid out, how's the barn designed, how's it organized. And a good example of that would be in the entryway, for example. So if you have an entryway that's is designed well, has a bench and a shower, has a floor that's coated with, let's say, something that's easily cleaned, doesn't have things on the floor, is generally clean, right? That's all those are structural aspects, right? How have they given thought to how the barn is actually built? So it has nothing to do with people are doing yet, right? It's related to it, of course, but it's just what environment or what facilities have we given people to do their job, and is it adequate, right? So that's the second aspect. The third aspect of the production process is the resources, and so that's kind of what do they have to do their job. And that's in terms of using the entryway again. Do they have, for example, cleaning supplies that are dedicated to each zone you've created, right? So do you have one for the dirty side of the bench? Do you have a separate set of cleaning supplies for the area between the bench and the shower? And then a third set of supplies for the clean side of the shower in the office, right? Have they given the employees the necessary resources in that case to do that job correctly, right, without creating biosecurity hazards? So that's kind of how we look at that. The resources can be non-physical too, right? So they know what they're supposed to do. Training, are they motivated? Do they think it's important? Those kinds of things we also look at try to evaluate those as well. But that's kind of the idea there. When we look at the production process, we want to understand both all three: the operating procedures, the structural aspects, how things are designed, and then the resources. What resources do people have to do their job? And so that's when we go out and do those, we're trying to pay attention, or we do pay attention to all of those. And it's, once you start looking at it that way, you will find lots of biosecurity hazards. They're there.
And so would you say, like, out of those three different aspects, is there one that sticks out more often than the others?
The structural, right? Because that's, once you build a building, once you build a barn, once you build a site, it's hard to change that, right? And so I would tell you, I've been on very, very few farms over my career, that a part of my career I've been doing this, that I would say this farm is very well designed with biosecurity in mind. We just have not built them that way. Most of the barns, I think, it doesn't appear that veterinarians had much input at all into their design. And so they're built more for low cost, logistic, trying to make things easy to do, or logistical reasons, I guess, is what I'm looking for there. But yeah, very few, I would say, especially if it's an older barn, very few are actually designed for biosecurity.
So would you recommend, if people are building a new barn, that they discuss with either a veterinarian or maybe with your team how to lay it out properly for biosecurity reasons?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If there's one thing that listeners take out of this, that would be it, right? And we are starting to see some more barns being built. We went through a period where the economics in the industry weren't very good, and so we weren't building anything, but we're starting to see that now. And so absolutely, I have seen some barns that I thought were really well designed, really well thought out. The entryway was well designed. The loadouts were well designed. The mortality removal area, was well designed, well thought out. And I've seen, for every one of those, I've seen probably, 50 that weren't well designed. But you have an opportunity when you build a new barn to do that well. And absolutely that you need to get that input from a veterinarian, because I can tell you, even today, if you leave that to the engineers, they will not build it with biosecurity in mind. So I can guarantee that.
Fair enough. They're good at other things, right?
Yeah, yep, exactly.
So are there any other learnings from, like, the last, say, 15 years or so of those disease outbreak investigations, like other things you've learned?
I think I guess I see a lot of cases where, they have really good SOPs, right? On paper, everything looks like it's being done, or should be done very well. And I hear people describe those farms sometimes, it has a very high level of biosecurity, right? Well, when you go out and actually dig into that, or when you do investigations on those farms, what you find is that's rarely the case, right? And you start looking at the structural aspects, the resource aspects, and even how do they know things are being done as the SOP outlines, right? And so you slowly start to pick those things apart, and before you know it, you've got a farm that, in their opinion, had a very high level of biosecurity, and they quickly come to understand that, well, okay, maybe not, maybe it wasn't it wasn't as high as we thought, right? And so it's just, a lot of it just comes down to that execution part, right? How do we actually execute these things? And I would say in general, as an industry too, that when it comes to being able to monitor and control things that are really important, again, those critical control points, that extends beyond biosecurity, right? There's some things that have nothing to do with biosecurity that we do every day that are really important for raising a healthy, viable pig, that we don't really monitor that closely, right? We just kind of trust that those things are going to get done reasonably well, and we leave it a lot of that to chance. But I think over time, there's some technologies coming online now that I think will help with that, being able to help monitor those things better. But it's about monitoring and then documenting, right? Collecting information, recording information about those things, how they're done, and then have the ability to come in and audit those afterwards, right? So it's monitoring, data recording, and then auditing. All three of those are an important part of once you've identified those critical control points. How do you make sure they happen correctly? And again, that's, I'd say, as an industry, not just biosecurity specifically, we just don't do that part very well yet today.
So who would you say should be responsible for those tasks, like the checking and then the auditing, etc.?
Well, I'm gonna shift back to the biosecurity part here again, because that would be a broader answer for just in general. But on the biosecurity part, I think this is an area where, I think the veterinarians probably aren't going to be the ones necessarily that are in charge of the day-to-day, making sure things are monitored and data recorded and then going and audit, right? I think veterinarians have to be involved in getting those systems set up, right? And determining where those critical control points and where we need to spend, the resources on monitoring. But I think once that's in place, that can be done by, any number of people in the industry with the pig experience, with understanding of how things work. And so I see some companies moving to starting to have positions like a biosecurity officer, or somebody like that does to go out and do audits. And so I think, that those people are already there. We just need to utilize them more effectively, I think. The other part of that is when you think about who on the farms is responsible for biosecurity, okay? Hopefully your answer is, well, everybody should be responsible, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's important too, where, we can do a better job of training people, not only to train them how to do things, right? Like here's how you use a bench, but also training them to think about identifying biosecurity hazards, right? So that hopefully can recognize when they maybe get into a situation where they have to make a decision about something, they can see that, okay, this decision is going to create biosecurity hazards, whereas this one may not, or at least not as many, right? And give them that knowledge. And I don't think everyone in the industry is probably open to that, being trained to understand that, but I think most are, right? And I think I really do think we need to move beyond kind of just the basic training how to do things to the, give people a better understanding of what it means to what a biosecurity hazard is and how to recognize it. So yeah, those are, I guess, all things that I kind of see recurring themes in the industry, I guess. So I guess I'll leave it at that. There's a few other things I see too, but.
So are there any other final recommendations that you can give producers when it comes to biosecurity or even like outbreak investigations? Yeah.
I think, another thing I see is when it comes to spending time, right? And, I think if you look at, you'd say, if, the outcome of biosecurity should be what? Well, it should be lower frequency of outbreaks. It should be fewer lateral introduction of viruses into groups of growing pigs that are place negative. If you look at that as your measure of success with biosecurity, I think it's in most systems today, it's probably pretty hard to argue that, we're making progress. Some it would be, but most probably not. And so you have to ask, okay, are we spending our time in the right areas? Are we spending enough of our resources on biosecurity to actually make sustainable progress? And so I think, today what I find veterinarians doing a lot is just putting out fires, right? They're so busy dealing with PRRS outbreaks that they don't have any time to spend on, okay, how do I figure out where the biosecurity hazards are? Okay, do I have time to go out and do a reasonably thorough outbreak investigation to do that? Do I have time to follow up with conversations with, the agronomy groups or the maintenance group or, whatever livestock transport groups? Do I have time to spend with them to make sure I understand fully what those production processes are so that I can identify where those hazards are and then have discussions to come up with control measures, identify the critical control points and come up with control measures to deal with them. We just don't have time to do that. The veterinarians that work in these systems just are so overwhelmed with all the other things they're doing, they don't have time. And so I think as an industry, if we want to make sustainable progress in biosecurity, we have to figure out a way to allocate resources to start doing outbreak investigations to start having those conversations about what are the critical control points, and then having conversations about what control measures and how are we going to monitor those, how are we going to do audits, and spend the time on that, right? So today I see farms that filter, sow farms, if they filter farms, they do take the time because they've invested a big chunk of money in that. And so then they do put in biosecurity auditors whose job is to go around the farms and make sure that if it's negative pressure ventilated, they're not having leaks and that the filters are in good condition, things like that. Spending a ton of time on that. Okay, so we are investing in that. Well, let's do that for all the other things too. Air is small part, right? It's a part, but it's not that big a part of all the biosecurity hazards. And so we need to, I think, take that same mentality that we do with filtration and say, okay, let's apply that to the rest of the entry events, all the other things in our farm, with that same rigor, same vigor, even though maybe we haven't spent a couple $100 per sow space yet on it, but we still need to have that same rigor brought to those entry events. And so I think until we get there as an industry, and there are examples out there, there's some companies that have got there already that are doing what I consider to be a fantastic job and have made progress. They have made a difference. They don't have as many outbreaks as they used to. So it can be done. And I just think we have to, as an industry, make up our mind that we're just going to have to bite the bullet and invest those resources.
It's time for our famous three.
Looking to boost the productivity and health of your swine herd? High D is the original pure source of 25-hydroxy-D3, proven in over 100 research trials and fed to millions of pigs each year in North America. High D improves bone strength, immune health, and enhances overall performance. Whether you want to improve sow longevity, get heavier nursery pigs, or help your grow-finish pigs thrive, trust the original, proven 25-hydroxy-D3 High D. Learn more at dsm-firmenich.com/hy-d.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, okay, thank you. So to our listeners, if you're enjoying this episode of the Swine at Canada podcast show presented by Biosecurity, please remember to like, subscribe, and share it with your colleagues, friends, and family. Okay, so that gets us to the final questions. So the first question is, what is your favorite book or resource?
Yeah, so I grew up Christian, not necessarily a good one. Probably, took a lot for granted. But I joined a men's group a couple of years ago here, or actually longer than that. But one of the things we've gotten onto is doing a Bible in a year. So it's video or audio recordings of just a small section every day. And so I've done that, working on the second year of that now. And so the Bible has become my favorite book. I think it's even if you're not religious, it's kind of a treatise on human behavior and human nature. And I just find it incredibly interesting now. So yeah, I would say that's become my favorite book.
Okay, interesting. And then the other question is, in your opinion, what sets successful swine professionals apart from those that are not?
Yeah, and that's I don't know that there's a good answer to that. I find in my experience, when I look back on my life, a lot of when I was young, if you'd asked me if I would be where I am today, I certainly wouldn't have told you that. When I started out, I grew up on a farm with cattle, so my dad actually didn't like pigs at all, so we never had them on the farm, and so just ending up in swine would I'd never have predicted that. So I think, to me, if I look back on my life, the things that I considered are probably made me consider myself successful or just bring some joy is just, taking those opportunities, right? Making sure when those things come, not saying, okay, I'm going to be this and I'm going to do everything I can. You have to be willing, I think, to take the opportunities that come to you. And so the other part of this, and I'll admit to you, I'm probably not very good at this, is the relationships are the most important part of that as you go through life. And probably, spent most of my life not feeling that way, that I felt like if I just worked my tail off and studied and gained knowledge and things like that, that was the route to surefire happiness or joy. And as I've gotten older, it's probably, I realize more that that's not necessarily the case. It's more about the relationships and the people. And so yeah, that's, I guess, we'll call that, at least 40 years of worth of wisdom there. So starting from when I was 20.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, so thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
All right. Thanks again, Brenda.
Okay, so that concludes another episode of the Swine in Canada podcast show. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And I'm looking forward to the next one. Until then.